Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Rising Importance of Software Testing and the New Wave of Strategies and Solutions for Driving CI/CD. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see your GoToWebinar control panel in the upper right corner of your computer screen, and you have joined the presentation listening to your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. If you have selected mic and speakers and are having any difficulty hearing me, please toggle the telephone option in your control panel and dial in. If you're experiencing any issues, please type the details in the questions section of your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing those questions into your questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view the recording. I would now like to pass the mic over to Kimberly Falk, Director of Product Marketing, who will be introducing the webinar. Kimberly?
Thank you, Kathleen. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's interactive webinar with Soft Labs and the Aberdeen Group analyst firm discussing the rising importance of software testing and the new wave of strategies and solutions for driving CI/CD. I'd like to welcome today's conversationalists, and I'm super excited to bring them all together for today's chat. If you haven't had the pleasure of hearing one of these gentlemen speak, then you are in for a real treat today. So welcome Marcus Merrell, Director of Technical Services and Customer Success at Soft Labs, Thomas Boyles, Director of Engineering and Development at Soft Labs, and Jim Rapoza, Research Director at Aberdeen. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly.
So for today's discussion, we're going to touch upon challenges organizations are facing when it comes to delivering high-performing, reliable, and CX-centric applications across platforms, as well as strategies leading organizations are following to shift testing left, right, and all the ways. And what are some of the common oversights companies experience when beginning to shift left and right, as well as how continuous testing can help you become a leader within your organization, and what organizations should also be thinking about in relation. What are some quick wins organizations can implement right now for to get more out the door, and wherever else the conversation may lead us today. So to begin, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what Jim is seeing as some of the current trends in DevOps and application development. So Jim, if you wouldn't mind touching upon, in addition to these stats, are any of these stats surprising to you? And from an overall business standpoint, what are these stats telling us? And of these stats, which are most critical for organizational leaders to pay attention to, and why?
Sure, yeah, happy to do that. So, the interesting thing, obviously, for those of us who follow testing on a regular basis, automation has been, for a few years now, one of the biggest trends in testing. I know there's, sometimes you see this in that best in class are 4 times more likely to be using automation. And in our research, we define best in class when we survey and analyze companies, that in this case that are doing testing. We ask them metrics questions, how their success in application quality and application uptime and application success. And we define the best in class as those who score in the top 20% of those. So those businesses, we find, and are 4 times more likely to be using automation. I think that's indicative of their success level and why some of the other businesses aren't in the best in class, because they're not using automation. As far as what's kind of surprising to me is the 42% of businesses that are implementing some form of AI or machine learning within their DevOps processes. I think, at first glance, that number might seem a little high. Obviously the way we ask that question, the some form is kind of a key there. Because, a lot of them aren't maybe in production with it yet. They're testing it out. They're doing some evaluation, running pilots, things like that. But still, that's a pretty high level of interest and something that I think most of us would consider sort of bleeding edge on the DevOps side. So those are probably the two biggest surprises to me. We hear continually about the trends on teaching developers to become testers. Obviously, that's a core component of shifting left, and also a lot of businesses that we hear from are teaching their QA people to learn to code and things like that. So those aren't huge surprises to me. And maybe the only other surprise is I do expect that continuous testing number to be a little higher, and I do expect it to continue to grow. But those are probably the biggest surprises to me. Obviously, there are other trends that we're tracking as well, but these were four that really jumped out in our sort of initial research.
Marcus or Thomas, thoughts?
I'm wondering, Jim, are you, this is the first time you've asked these questions, first time you've seen these poll results? Because I want to see this over time, over the next couple of years to find out how that's going to trend. Because, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just as someone who used to be a tester who learned to code and has now taught a lot of developers to test, I know that sometimes it's sticky and sometimes it's not. I'm wondering over time what kind of trend can you ballpark it? Do you think that it's going to be sticky, or is it going to be something that we see in a few years people are still struggling with?
It's interesting. We do track these over time. Automation, we've seen sort of a regular growth curve on that. The AI is still relatively new. Continuous testing, I think over the last year or so, we've seen a pretty significant jump in that. But the interesting thing, I totally agree. When we talk about things like shift left, and I know this. When you talk to firms and stuff, that kind of thing is where you're most likely to see pushback, and you're also more likely to see that sort of, okay, we implemented this, it did well for a little while, and then kind of people went back to their old processes and practices. But it is, I do think we're seeing a continuous growth there. And to a large degree, it does rely on, products like yours and testing development tools and other things like that, making testing more integral to the entire development process. I think the more, from a developer standpoint, I don't have to leave my environments and things like that to do testing. I'm more likely to do it, and from a QA, from a tester standpoint, the more easily I'm able to jump back into the code and see things and understand what I'm looking at, the more likely I am to use those type of things.
Yeah, fast feedback loop, super important. Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I'm just wondering if people really specifically mentioned context shifting, because that's actually a really interesting topic to me as a dev manager, and I get that feedback a lot from my own developers. If they have something where they don't have to jump around too much, they're much happier, they're more productive. There's less opportunity for one of those pieces to fail. It's an interesting point.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, and we do hear that about not every time you have to jump a window, jump out of your environment, jump out of your tools is an opportunity to just not do it. we do see that. Yeah.
I know that in my experience as someone who's been doing this for a while, it's always a matter of getting not just the grassroots developers buying in on shifting left, but also the director and executive level carving out time and making sure that they have a commitment to the delivery of this, not just saying, hey, why don't you do this? It's more like you have to commit to it at the executive level.
Marcus, that's a really amazing point, actually. If culture doesn't come from the top down, it doesn't really change, and that needs to be kind of like something they're told to do. Like, this is part of your job now. Please go make that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's something that needs follow-up, as well. I know I was lucky enough to attend your conference a few weeks ago, and one of your panelists, one of your keynoters, spoke about that, how he went back and looked at the implementation. He made these moves and looked back to make sure it was happening, and took steps to kind of reinforce that culture shift. So I think, that's a great point about having that top-level buy-in.
Yeah.
Jim, I was kind of curious. Did you ask people if they were measuring these, in any kind of OKR or any kind of long-term way? Because it is one thing to say please go take this on as a concern, but I'm kind of curious, are they tracking it, and is
we asked about their analytics and the different ways that they're tracking quality. Obviously, what we do too is because we ask these sort of extensive surveys, we kind of take a big data approach to it ourselves, and we can kind of look at the businesses that said they're doing it and look at their metrics ourselves to see what kind of success they're having. So yeah, we kind of can get at it from both sides.
Very interesting.
Why don't we move into our first poll question? And we'd love for those of you that are attending today's webinar to please choose one of the following answers. So the following trends, which is your organization placing most focus on? Is it testing automation, AI and machine learning, developers learning to test and testers learning to code, or shifting right and continuous testing? So my question to our today's conversationalists, or gentlemen, what are you seeing trending amongst organizations?
I see a lot of talk around AI and machine learning, but I see a lot of work being done around test automation. Testing automation is, for 10 years, for me, has been the thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Like there are definitely a lot of data scientists working on machine learning and trying to make it a thing, but I have yet to see anything like truly substantial. Like oftentimes they're either doing it as a marketing thing or they're trying to figure out how to apply it, and it's much more like simple and algorithmic. But I really am curious to hear what people's experiences are like on that. Jim, I'm hoping you can share some information about that later, because there's some interesting possibilities in there. And yeah, I echo that. I mean, testing automation, people really understand that that's the way to make cleaner code ship faster, and if they're following DevOps practices, they want nice tight feedback loops, they want small bites. And that's just kind of how you empower that,
Yeah, no, exactly like you said. I mean, automation has been one of our continuous, we've seen continuous growth in that for years now. That I think, we've overall seen a huge jump in interest in testing. Businesses that didn't used to do testing are now much more interested in doing testing. And I do think that the growth in the capabilities in automation have made them, more comfortable taking those steps, giving them a lot more power and a lot more sort of capabilities. The interesting thing again, I think AI and machine learning is still kind of on the bleeding edge, and you see it more in other areas. So you're probably likely to see it more, obviously from a testing standpoint, you're more likely to see it in visual testing and things like that. Obviously this question was about DevOps too, so they might be using it in, in their actual development processes as well. But yeah, definitely automation we've seen a huge growth in, and I do think some of these things around continuous testing and the other areas are also still relatively newer trends.
So Jim, along those lines, that's how our poll respondents also voted. So 60% are placing the most focus on testing automation, followed well down the road by continuous testing at 19%, and 15% of developers learning to test and testers learning to code, and then followed just with 3% at AI and machine learning.
Yep.
Interesting, because it seems like all the VC money is going towards the AI and machine learning these days.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
Absolutely. So continuing on from our poll, so then what challenges do many, or is it actually most organizations face relative to the current trends that we just discussed?
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously this is data from my research. And to understand too, this is a question we asked of a general IT population. So, sometimes, when you get in sort of, I don't want to say echo chambers, but, topics focused areas, so if I was asking, the group on this webinar, some of these questions, we would see different numbers. But, this goes with our research where, like I said, we've seen this renewed interest in testing across the board from businesses that maybe for a long time haven't done any testing or done very limited amount of testing. And they're very interested in getting into it now. A lot of this is coming from the top, from the C-suite, where they understand that they need application quality, that their end users have really high expectations. The days of just having apps or just having things are well gone. I mean, no matter who you are, whether you're a small bank or small retail firm or whatever, your customers expect the applications and services they use from you to be as good as Google and Facebook and Amazon and everybody else. So, and for good or for better or worse, that's the reality we live in. So we've definitely seen a huge interest from businesses across the board looking to bring testing in to increase quality. But for these businesses, these are some of the challenges to seeing that they don't have the tools. And a lot of times when you talk to these businesses that haven't been engaged in testing for a while, they still think of older tools from 10, 15 years ago as what testing is done with, and they remember those as being really expensive, really complex, tough to use. And obviously, when you're in that kind of situation, you don't have the type of internal expertise needed for using modern testing tools. So when we ask general business, these were the top challenges we've seen. But I know you guys talk to regular customers all the time. I'm kind of curious what some of the challenges you've heard.
Well, the interesting thing that comes out to me about this is, to me, the 48% say we lack effective testing tools, to me, shows that they think a tool will give them good testing just by itself, functional testing. Now, because when you look at security testing, you can point someone at a URL and say, what are the OAuth top 10 issues I have to solve? You point to a URL and the tool gives you the answers. Performance and load testing, you give it a website, you say, this is the kind of traffic I need to simulate, go. And they don't need domain expertise, but functional testing requires the kind of domain expertise that no tool can give you. So to me, this belies kind of a misunderstanding of what functional testing is. And I would say that I'm very surprised this number isn't flipped or way more. To me, what I see is a lack of testing expertise, not a lack of tools.
Yeah, and that the numbers would be higher. But I mean, as people learn, they tend to discover more of what they don't know. And I would imagine that as they take that DevOps transformational journey, that their opinion would sort of probably go down of the tools and of their own expertise, and they would realize they had to learn more. And I mean, this is what go ahead.
What do you think, Jim? I mean,
I know. I mean, I know we've had this discussion before. A lot of when you talk to those C-level who don't understand testing, they want they want to buy like a box. They think they can buy, testing in a box type of appliance or something like that that'll solve all their problems. And as once they start to dig in and once they start to talk to their DevOps teams and then they realize there's a lot more involved there. But I think they also start to realize once they see it in action, they see how functional testing would work. They start to understand that it isn't. I don't want to say as hairy as they might have thought, but the capabilities are different. That the ways you can use it are different than what they think. And I think once the businesses do get engaged and start to even get that first base level of understanding, you start to see a lot more realization of what they can do.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes all it takes is one true believer to actually sort of convert people. Because once they start understanding the kind of thinking that you need to have to really make this work, it starts to become obvious. But it isn't obvious if you've never done it before and you just don't know. It's so interesting.
Yeah, and you'll see one group that's doing really well and all the metrics has great quality, and they're the ones who do testing, and then once the business kind of recognizes that, they say, why isn't everybody doing this? So
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, metrics are very hard to dispute. Even if you don't understand something, you can look at a progress report or some kind of output at that and say okay, well, I don't know what this is, but we should be looking at it more and trying to understand it. And it can be very convincing.
Yeah.
So along the lines of the conversation that you all are having right now, why is shifting left, right, and all the way so important?
I personally think that the reason testing is in the state it's in right now is because of this sort of lack of domain expertise that is, it's appreciated at the corporate level. And we're trying to move the expertise to where we believe it really lies, which is with the developer. That's where we have resources. That's where we have people we know understand the product. And that's where we know that developers can write tests that inherently run faster and more stably because they are already in the code, in the stack, they understand what is expected. So I think that it's a natural progression to say that the same folks writing the code for the feature should be the ones writing the test. There's some philosophical disagreement with that, but I think fundamentally it's kind of an obvious answer that has been in front of us all along, and now the tooling and the expertise has become more prominent to allow it. That's my take. What do you think, Thomas or Jim?
I think that's true. I mean, honestly, there's some really interesting thinking coming out of obviously DevOps and some of the like Kaizen and Kanban stuff about like you want to try and reduce as much like non-cohesive coupling as you can between all of the kind of units of the system that you're running, and just having your developers like test internally to themselves like in really fast loops is one of those ways that you just make the system run faster. That way when they do have to deal with a dependency set, which is shipping code out to like a website or whatever, the quality is just so much higher. And again, this is one of those things that it is nice to see that it's coming up, and I feel like people that are really studying software and studying business trends and really kind of applying systems thinking to this like get it, but you got to bring people along, and yeah, I wish they taught that more in business school, because it's a pretty useful skill just broadly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
The interesting thing, though, I've seen, and we have seen, a great rise in shifting left. That businesses, pushing testing further into the early stages of the development cycle. But there is, I do feel like that's where you see the most pushback as well. That's where, like you said, you need the developers to do it. You need the developer buy-in, but you also see probably the highest level of resistance on that side. It's interesting when you talk shift right. I do believe that there's more, we do the CSI research, there's more, people on that side of the production cycle recognize the need for testing. They're the ones who have to live with daily issues, and other trends I think are driving that as well. If you're developing, containers, you're using Kubernetes, you're building microservices, you're sort of in a constant development production cycle as it is, and at that point you really need to be doing continuous testing, and definitely even if you were doing it shifting left already, you realize you need to be bringing it to the whatever you want to call it, second day or shifting right side of the equation.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that too. Sorry, Marcus, go ahead.
I was just going to say part of the problem also with shifting left that I've seen in many different organizations is that you get the executive buy-in in some cases, and then what you see is an immediate slowdown in velocity and features because people are spending all this time testing. I think eventually that gets cleared and you start to see the velocity speed up as the release confidence goes up, as the green builds start to roll in and you're able to release faster. But some people can't weather that storm, even though it is lowering their risk. It's just hard to last through the 3 to 6 months that it takes to get through that velocity slowdown.
Yeah, it's a long-term thinking kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that goes to the expertise that we were talking about as well. I think once businesses learn how to test, they learn how to use automation to speed testing, they learn how to leverage testing experts to work with the development team to build the right tests. Those kind of things definitely speed up that cycle and help you get over that initial hump.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is really counterintuitive and scary. Like there are patterns out there where people are shipping once a quarter, and they have completely different teams deploying the code, and they don't have owner-operator models, and there are teams that do have owner-operator models and are doing continuous delivery, and those teams seem to be the ones that are kind of forced to be doing better testing in their own testing, and they're the ones that I think kind of tend to be more successful at it, at least at the outset. But oftentimes they're going into the proposition knowing that they need to do it. So, I mean, it's a deep, scary transformation if you really want to make it work. But you kind of have to have faith in it, or you really have to have seen it before, or just at least understand the theory behind it to really invest. And you do have to be influential enough to be like, hey, like as Marcus said, like, this is going to hurt for a couple months, but please trust me, it'll be okay. And here's the paper that says it will. So,
yep.
Great. Well, I think this is a good segue into our next poll question. So my organization is currently placing emphasis on shifting left, right, or all the way.
Started watching the results come in. It's pretty striking.
And I was about to ask, my question I was about to ask is, Jim, Thomas, and Marcus, what's your guess on how most of our attendees will respond, but I think we're already greatly seeing, as even with just 30% of the vote coming in, that already about 60% are saying left, 4% right, and closely followed, I guess, by 33% all the ways, and left is just skyrocketing, and all the ways is coming up behind. So.
I think truthfully, people have been shifting right for years. We just didn't call it that. I mean, all the APM monitoring, performance testing kind of stuff you do, that is effectively shifting right. We've already done it to an extent. I think that we're just calling it that because there's a functional element to it that I believe needs to be applied here to sort of smooth out the big bell you see when it comes to where the testing bottlenecks are. And so that's just my guess, is that we've already shifted right, and so we're just not calling it that. So
yeah, I think that's correct.
Yeah, but I do think that's the key point. Your point about bringing functional, because those traditional APMs generally just been more about performance, about uptime, things like that, and not bringing in the functional kind of capabilities. And I think as you move those things to the right, you're going to see more benefits. And I always say, when a lot of times, if for years, if you've sat in on any kind of testing presentation and somebody puts out their application lifecycle chart, the bar, it'll be, you'll see like, development and stuff of that, and then testing will be in this little tiny bar between, like if you had it on a scale of 1 to 100, between like 25 and 35%, and then everything, and then you move on to production and deployment and stuff like that. And I've always said, part of the whole thing is not really about shifting right or shifting left, or it is continuous because it is about kind of expanding that mindset. So basically, the testing bar goes from from 1 to 100% on that chart as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing that I'm hoping that we get in the future is it seems like an obvious play to me to marry the analytics that a site is throwing off that tell the story of the user's behavior and tie that to APM so that you can actually start monitoring user behavior and see if there are things that deviate from the standard of a path. And so to me, marrying functional analytics with monitoring is something that I think will have a huge impact. It's just that it really hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. So the context created by that is going to be extremely powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we talked about this before. I mean, to me, that is kind of the holy grail. And when you talk about AI and machine learning, if you can bring that to that kind of capability. So if I have like AI machine learning that's looking at live data from production application over whatever period of time, several days, week, months, and learning about how the app is used, where problems are, where issues occur, and when you can just bring that back into your testing. I totally agree. That's the holy grail. I mean, because that's then you actually find, as with all AI type things, you start to find things that you didn't know were problems.
Well, I mean, really, and also as skeptical as I've been in some cases of AI and machine learning, you can't do this without AI and machine learning. It simply can't be done. So that's to me the application of the future.
Yeah, it is, and honestly, that's where the technology is kind of starting to shine. Like recognizing patterns and being able to pull it in, and it's almost at the point where it can actually create meaning out of the data, which is something that humans used to have to do. And let's face it, I mean, we're not exactly super high powered when it comes to like being able to pull in multiple threads of data and make sense out of it. And it's an exciting time.
And it allows you to overcome biases too. I know I've seen it for years, and I have a testing background. My first tech job out of college was in QA, and I ran testing labs for years. And a lot of times, in the creation of tests and everything, there's always kind of your own bias. You kind of think where the problems are going to be. What you're testing for, and you're right some of the time, but sometimes you're wrong. I do think that when you bring that kind of real data into the equation, we've seen it on the security side, and I do think once you bring that in, it'll really expand the capability of businesses to find those problems.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, you're basically talking about like the heuristic nature of human thinking, and while that is a way that machine learning could work, it's got a lot more resources at its disposal, and a good machine or a good data scientist can put those into play.
Yeah. Cool.
Great. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about the conversation that that you and Thomas and Marcus have been having right now, and particularly with machine learning and AI, and how that relates to your recent research and based on the stats that we're showing on the screen right now?
Yeah, so earlier I talked about our sort of best-in-class metrics. Those businesses that are scoring in the top 20 or so percent in application performance. The ones that get all the highest scores. And when we looked at that, when we dug into our data, we saw that they were 45% more likely to be doing continuous testing, to be testing, as I kind of talked about. If you looked at their testing bar, it covers the entire life cycle of their application deployment, or at least pretty close to that, anyways. And that's it's not really surprising. The surprising thing would be I kind of expect that number to be a little bit higher. But to a certain degree, a lot of businesses that score well in quality, they're bringing other things to the table to help them get there as well. But again, that's still a pretty significant delta that they're that much more likely than their competitors to have leveraged continuous testing. And I do expect that to continue. As I said, our data on this has been rising steadily, and going in with that poll question, predominantly from the shift left perspective. We ask businesses, where are you moving testing in the life cycle, and the number is always kind of on that side of the spectrum. And again, as we kind of discussed, maybe shift right has been something that's existed for a while, but also, as we've discussed, shift left is where you're running into the most hurdles, the most roadblocks, the most resistance. So there's, it makes sense that there's a pushback there. And just in general, looking at this, I do think, if you're a business that's in the best in class when it comes to application performance and quality, you probably have gotten most of your culture questions settled. And I do think that is the key. If you have the right culture, if you have the right kind of teams and the right kind of mindset on application quality, that all of these things kind of come naturally to you, and you're less likely to run into resistance. And I'd be curious, Marcus and Thomas, what you think. Obviously, you're out there talking to your customers, working with them on a regular basis. What do you see from the businesses that are really good at it as opposed to the ones that are still trying to figure it out?
For my part, I think just as an aside, I'm concerned. I'm generally kind of not one for buzzwords, but I've latched on to shift left because I believe in it. I'm afraid that we might be headed to a point, because of the resistance you talked about, where shift left is this thing that we'll talk about in 6 years. As you remember when we tried that and it didn't work? That's what I'm afraid of most. But I really believe in it. I really think it is a good, positive thing for people to do to transform their business. And I'm afraid they're going to be talking about it in 6 years, like they've been like we now talk about, like XP. For a lot of people, still believe in it. A lot of people, it was just this thing we tried in the early 2000s. I hope I'm wrong.
That's I do too. I think that's highly dependent on how it's implemented. It's just like leading an agile transformation. Like, there's a lot of companies that just tell everybody to go buy the elements of Scrum, and then they start doing Scrum. And then there's companies that actually, like, from the top down, everybody takes Scrum Master training, and then they really understand what they do, and they employ coaches and things like that. If people don't really understand why you're doing this, they're probably going to have, or could potentially have, that experience, the bad side, and it would be nice if it kind of worked for them anyway, but there's a possibility the resistance could overwhelm the benefits in too short of a time. So
to answer your question, Jim, what we're seeing in the market right now is guidance and not tooling. So we are offering some tooling in sort of like, the headless offering that we've got, but mostly when my team goes out and works with clients directly, it is all about culture, advice, getting that executive sponsorship, figuring out where they are along the way in their continuous testing journey, and helping them at each step with the different, identifying the risks that are there and the kinds of steps they need to take for seeing it. But right now, we've seen a few companies that kind of nailed it. And what I'd be very curious about in your data, Jim, is to break it out horizontally and vertically, like horizontally by company size and vertically by retail versus banking versus, Amazon, whatever. And I'd be curious to see, we don't have to go super deep into it now, but I mean, like, that's how I would like to see it. And I think that my team could do a really good job of offering better services if we understood what verticals and horizontals are having trouble in these areas.
Yeah, I might also throw another dimension on that, which is sort of age of their DevOps transformation. You know, like, did they start like that? Did they just get going? Like, how long have they been really, you know, I mean, there's got to be a way to render that, because the people that start, you know, they're true believers from the beginning. The people that have to do a cultural change, well, they have to do a cultural change and then do the work. And yeah,
and part of the problem is you need the hero and you need the true believer, and heroes and true believers do not scale. And that's the problem. You need to get education out there for everyone.
Those are really good point, Marcus.
Along those lines of educating everyone, let's talk a little bit about how Soft Labs is helping organizations on their journey to CI/CD.
Okay, Thomas, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, we obviously care a lot about our products, and most of our customers are actually us. You know, they're people like us. So we're always eating our own caviar, I guess. And then the other is we're really trying to make sure that we're paying attention to the trends and the frustrations that people are coming in contact with. And you know, we're trying to make the existing stuff better, and then we're trying to make sure that, you know, we're forward-looking enough to serve better paradigms. And there's a lot of emphasis on that right now. You know, like, SaaS is kind of going through a bit of an innovation kind of renaissance, which is exciting. You know, but a lot of that's coming out of, like, having really good developers that are trying to use, like, more future-looking tools and then bringing them back and pitching them and shipping them, like, performance and headless and stuff like that. You know, and I think the biggest thing that we can really do to help people is just really empower them with good tools, and then make sure that they're easy to use. And, you know, like, the education on the customer side, I think, is actually Marcus's bag, and I'm really curious to hear kind of what you guys think about this, as well as any frustrations that you have.
I mean, a couple things on that. Just really that I'm really glad that we offer the services of my team kind of complementary, because we know that making people successful all along this journey is key to making them better partners for us and realizing the full value. The other thing is that we have just kind of recently started to understand that when you have a platform that people run 2 million functional tests on every day, you have a lot of information about what people are trying to do, what they're succeeding at, what they're failing at. And we're trying to start to think about questions we can ask this data set that will provide the kinds of input and guidance that people really want to know. Then that's honestly one of the primary reasons I came to work at this company. Is I had that realization a year and a half ago, and I thought, well, if I can help, you know, move this conversation forward and gain real insights, then this is going to be a pretty amazing way to transform the business. Not just mine, but everyone.
Thinking like an architect there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of stuff that you do for people, I think, is really fundamental to their success. You know, like, anybody who's been doing, you know, like, SaaS for a long time, especially when the product is sufficiently complicated and just, like, you know, there's a learning curve, they really understand that education and mentorship and just support is key to, one, making them successful, and then two, like, making the business successful, because you don't want them to churn because they just don't know how to use it, or they've decided to go a different way. Like, you want to make them an expert as fast as possible. And it's just generous. Like, all your guys they're great teachers and they're good technologists, and it's nice to see.
I think one thing that my team has, so my team is the solution architects. There's 6 or 7 of us who go to companies and help teach and train on the product, and also help analyze data, stuff like that. But the main thing, the defining characteristic of them, is that all of them have around 8 to 12 years of test architecture, test automation, architecture experience. And so what they bring to the table, in addition to everything you just mentioned, is empathy. They understand where the customer is generally going to be in terms of their journey, and they understand what is the consequence of missing something like executive sponsorship, and how do I understand. You know, some people don't have that perspective, and I think that's a unique piece that we offer on this team.
It is, and to build on that, like, you know, a lot of your guys are really, really involved in the community just outside of sauce, and because they're passionate about it. I mean, you have people writing bindings and going and speaking at conferences, and you know, it's like they're the real deal. Like, without sauce, like, there's still people that are helping advance the state of the art and making people's lives better.
But also, we're empowered to give advice that might actually, in the short term, lead to less usage. If we can get stability going with less usage for a little bit of time, then we can expand the usage as we increase the success of the customer. That's something that we're all empowered to do, because our job is to make people successful. If we make them successful, in the long term, they're going to be a great partner. They're not going to forget about us. So that's a thing I'm very key on.
It is good. It means we're an engineering-led company, and like if I were the CTO and I saw that the bill went down a little bit because we showed you how to do it better, I would be like, these guys, we should stick with them.
Yeah. Yep. Jim, anything to add?
Let's go back the other way. I'd love to give our attendees just a few of your takeaways, and Thomas and Marcus, please feel free to jump into this conversation as well. So why it's important for continuous testing and automation to put it into everyday practice for getting these better quality apps out the door faster, also while satisfying quite a fickle customer base.
Yeah, getting to the, if you were looking at that last slide, we had a stat up there from ours about that, how businesses are that have shifted left are 40% more likely to see higher customer retention. And across the board, we have benefits like that in our research for businesses that have shift left, that they see much higher application use, that they're more likely to meet their SLAs, that they're, see increases in sales and revenue. So, part of my thing, when you ask about is shift left going to be a thing that people see as kind of failed in a few years, I think the metrics that we're seeing will mean that make that not the case. That there's just too many benefits, really clear benefits from doing it for your application quality, for your overall process quality, and just that the returns are too high. It may end up being one of those trends in a few years where people talk about like, oh, remember that was a big deal, and now it's just something you do. I think that might be more of the. It's like, why was that such a big deal? It's just like it's like breathing air, type of thing.
Well, we hope people are starting to think of this being strategic, right?
Yeah.
Because if your competitor is doing it and you're not, you're going to lose.
Yeah, good point. Hope so.
Yeah, and that's oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kim. I was just going to say, and that's what our recommendations kind of boil down to is that, the benefits are pretty clear, and it's just, we've seen time and again that by shifting left, by taking that time to not just build a quality app in the development process, but through the entire life cycle, testing at all stages, doing all the necessary types of tests. Again and again, we just see that is key towards the businesses that have the highest levels of success, and not just success as far as like the quality of their applications, but we've also found that those businesses are more likely to be already innovating in other areas. They're the ones who are already using containers. They're the ones who are already dabbling in AI. They're the ones who've been, to answer your question earlier, they are the ones who've been doing CUCD and DevOps for a longer period. So, from our research, that taking that move of shifting left and even, in the process of doing that, basically becoming a continuous testing, it pays dividends pretty much across the board.
Yeah, I mean, just reducing things like rework and mean time to fix means that you have a lot more time to spend on more generative stuff. And like, it's no wonder, right? Like, you take away like having to like ship a patch and have everybody run around with their hair on fire, and then you have time to think about like what's your new product, or like how could we be doing other things better, and it becomes this very positively amplifying feedback loop.
The confidence that you get from running a green build that doesn't take time, and the fact that you can switch context quickly, the amount of confidence you get from that, if you haven't been through it before, it is absolutely game-changing for your career and for what you expect out of a software platform. Not many people have experienced that, but when they do, I don't think they can ever go back. It's transformative to business.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why don't we go ahead and open it up to some questions that have come in. So one of the questions that has come in during this time is, what are the key principles to shifting testing left, and how do you determine which types of testing should be shifted left?
Marcus?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so to me, the one of the key principles is, so when I say shift left, I am presuming that you're getting away from browser-based, fully functional end-to-end testing, and you're moving more towards AI. Sorry, not AI. Good grief. I'm reading something. Towards the sort of headless API kinds of testing. And to me, one of the keys is to take the functional tests that you have that do all the work in the browser, figure out which of those operations actually have an API or a service behind them,
Yes.
and do the testing against that service instead.
Yes.
And so what we try to do is we have a long running test that has 15 steps in it. There's a good chance in a lot of organizations that 10 of those steps you can use an API to get the application in the state you want it to be in, then open a browser, do 2 quick operations, call an assertion, and then you're done. To me, shifting left involves really thinking about how to convert a browser test into an API test or a headless test, and then run it earlier in the cycle, and it goes much faster. It's a lot more reliable. That's my quick answer.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. The only other thing I would say with that is it really, really helps to measure code coverage on both sides, and end-to-end code coverage can be difficult. Functional testing can be difficult to measure, but you really want to try. And then you also really want to be looking at like things like mean time to fix, because like that is one of those like basic measures of your overall quality. And you should be able to see it. And if you can see it move, that's great. Hopefully it's moving up, down with the meantime. But like as you reduce that overall mass of end-to-end tests, like that number should be getting better. If it isn't, then you need to do something different, but at least you kind of start to track it.
So tied to the mean time to fix is the concept of like the escape rate. What defects are arriving in production, are you discovering in production? It's tied to that. And so if you see that number go down and the mean time to fix go down, both of those are excellent metrics to tell you that you're getting the testing done and you can have higher confidence in your releases.
Yeah, totally agree. And this one, I think, really kind of only applies to like, well, I think it's pretty general, like deployment frequency. Like provided you don't have some hard reason why you're not deploying more, like this should also make your deployment frequency go up. So.
Great. So question coming in is, what advice would you all give to someone who is attempting to implement automated testing in a job where manual has been the only form for the longest time? Thomas?
That's a complicated question. Yeah. So there is some psychology behind this, and I think I'm going to start with that. If you're the lowest person on the totem pole and you are in a big QA team and you suddenly say, like, I'm going to write Selenium tests for all of this, it might not go well for you. Stature has a lot to do with how you create organizational change. It does go better if you have somebody who's really, truly empowered to push that. So hopefully it's the CTO saying, hey, please go do this. So just putting that on the table. It's not that it's not impossible, but it's fraught. And then when you start,
I'm nodding my head.
Yeah, because it's threatening. The same way machine learning is threatening to testers, right? I mean, this stuff could disrupt, and your ability to reset your career even is sometimes in question. But from the perspective of just getting started, start small. Start with something that doesn't necessarily matter. Like if you have a single service, maybe not a monolith, but a single service that's just being built, and it's easy to deploy and you can check it. That's kind of where I would begin, and I would use that as a basis. Like one, you're going to need to learn whatever framework you decide to implement. There's a lot of caveats to all of these frameworks and the infrastructure as well. That's one of the reasons we sort of push, like, if it's not strategic, try and use a SaaS product. And then prove it, like show other people and build influence. And if you can just kind of ramp it up and continue to give yourself successes, visible successes, like eventually it should become obvious. And then again, measure it, like measure whatever you're doing. And because you really need to be able to show certain kinds of people numbers, otherwise they just won't believe you. Like saying you really think it's a good idea is not compelling. Saying I have numbers here showing why this is lowering costs and improving quality, very compelling.
I think also, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is that it's the realization that, even at the businesses, a lot of businesses I've seen that heavily embrace automation, they still do some manual testing,
Yeah.
And it's really about like sort of shifting the ratio, from you might start out with a small ratio of automated testing with most manual, and it's moving to where it's mostly automated, and sometimes you drop to manual for certain things.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, most of these products are being used by people, and you do want to do things like user acceptance testing, especially the product owners. Like, they should know how their product works, and they should be looking at it on a regular basis. But most of this stuff doesn't require empathy, not empathy. It doesn't require like the kind of thinking that people put. Like, it's a logical action. Sorry.
I was going to say that to me, one key element, so I've changed in my approach to this. I used to not really care much that the testing framework was implemented in the same language as the application framework or application development team. I now have shifted, you want the test automation that you're starting out to build to be contagious. You want it to be low friction and contagious. And now I advocate that people should probably, if you're doing a React.js UI, you should probably do something like WebDriver IO or JavaScript for testing. If you're doing a Java Spring Boot, you should use the Java bindings and one of the Java frameworks that we offer as a sample to get started. And that way you can combine it in the same repo, and you can have a little teaching session with your folks. And if you build your page object model correctly, the developers should not need to know how to use Selenium in order to be able to start writing some basic tests.
Yep, that's a really good point. People do not like to shift context. It's like kind of anathema. And if you make it easy for them, like, you're going to get a far better conversion rate.
Yeah, my last company, we saw a lot of success. We had developers writing Selenium tests in the same Java framework language, JUnit framework, and in the same repo. It was just seamless. It was part of the job. They had coverage numbers that they had to hit with their functional tests. And we had a green build with 700 Selenium tests, and it was not that hard.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful, by the way.
Yeah, it's rare too.
So our final question of the day, Jim, how is business changing their testing model to be faster and more responsive to DevOps speed? What are you seeing in your research?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think the move to Agile and DevOps is kind of what drove this renewed interest we've seen in testing over the years, and it was kind of a reverse thing because when I first was talking to businesses about their move to Agile and CI, and they a lot of the initial conversations were around needing less testing. This whole idea that we're revving every couple of weeks, every few weeks. We're going to fix problems all the time. We don't need to be doing as much testing. And then as businesses sort of adopted their DevOps model, they realized they were actually making problems worse, that they were carrying issues over multiple revs that often became, you talk about mean time to fix. If you've had an issue in an app for, 3 or 4 revisions, the mean time to fix that, once you eventually figure it out, it becomes really hairy. So that's been one of the interesting thing is that it turned completely around. People went from thinking they needed to do less testing because of DevOps and Agile to realizing I think that's been the big driver to shift left to continuous testing, that businesses have said, if we're continuously, developing, we need to be continuously testing as well. And the sooner we find issues, no matter, whether it is functional or visual or whatever, the better the quality of our app and the less work we're going to have to do down the line.
Yeah. I think helping make it cheaper to do that helps as well. Like if it's not some multi-tens of thousands of dollar product that you need to implement and then send people to classes, it's a lot easier. It's not that it's not hard, but anybody can download like the Selenium jar and just start using it. Like it's pretty free and you can run it in a lot of different contexts, so it makes it pretty easy to do. And it seems like the compute necessary to make it work gets cheaper and cheaper every day too. So
yep,
it helps.
Cool.
Well, Jim, Thomas, Marcus, thank you so much, gentlemen, and what a wonderful conversation today. And I'm now going to turn it, and thank you to all of our attendees as well, greatly appreciated. And now I'm going to turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you're going to receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate it if you'd complete that and provide your feedback. You'll also receive an email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Sauce Labs and our presenters, thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.